Good evening. I'm Hugh Hewitt, president of the Nixon Foundation. Tonight is the third meeting of the Nixon Seminar. All of the bios of the members of the seminar, whom you can see now on your screen, can be found at nixonseminar.com, as well as a continually updated feed of their collected writings. When the foundation stood the seminar up in February, Secretary Pompeo said he welcomed the opportunity to co-chair it, but warned that tonight he would be a night he could not be there to lead along with Ambassador Robert O'Brien due to a prior commitment. So I asked Ambassador O'Brien if tonight could be a seminar focused on how the National Security Council actually works, has worked, is supposed to work, and if we could also focus on its future. The NSC, as it is known, began in 1947 and for 75 years has been the principal forum used by the President of the United States for the consideration of national security, military, and foreign policy matters with senior national security advisors and cabinet members. Former NSC advisors form a sort of club, as does everyone who has participated in the NSC's meetings, many of whom are part of the Nixon Seminar. Not only was Ambassador O'Brien the national security advisor, Dr. Nadia Shadlow and Matt Pottinger are former deputy national security advisors, Alex Gray, a former chief of staff of the NSC, and I count not less than half a dozen members of the seminar who have been involved in its meetings or deputies meetings. Ambassador O'Brien is, of course, qualified to lead this by experience, but we also wanted to show you the sort of professionalism that develops among the bipartisan group of those who serve on the NSC over the years. And I want to use the opening tonight as well to introduce Ambassador O'Brien to our viewing audience more completely, our co-chair, than time is previously allowed. First, by this 3-minute clip, which may embarrass the ambassador a bit, but does the job better than I can. It's by former Utah governor and ambassador to both China and Russia, John Huntsman, who said this about Ambassador O'Brien.
It's now my great honor to introduce Robert O'Brien, who's here with Lo-Marie. Lo-Marie, we're so pleased to have you here. Thank you for it. Robert is a remarkable human being. And having worked with, I started counting them this morning, Robert, national security advisors, probably 7 or 8. Robert has a unique quality of being liked by everybody because he's fair, because he's smart, because he knows how to coordinate the interagency process, which is the most important thing a national security advisor can do. Surprisingly, some don't, and they get off on their own tangents ideologically and pursue their own agendas. Robert is the archetype when it comes to national security advisors. I told him once earlier that he was the closest thing I've seen to Brent Scowcroft. Born and raised in Ogden, Utah, in terms of his ability to navigate the interagency process and to serve the president as well as he does. Robert has been the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, where he came to some notoriety. I knew him as SPIHA, because in government everything is an acronym. The Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, where he carried the rank of ambassador. What's remarkable about Robert is the depth and diversity of his background. Things like co-chairing the State Department's Partnership for Justice Reform in Afghanistan, no simple task, under Republicans and Democrats. Being a former U.S. representative to a UN General Assembly session, a big deal in terms of understanding multilateral diplomacy. Senior legal officer that decided claims against Iraq resulting from the first Gulf War. The list goes on and on and on. He's worn a uniform, a major in the Army Reserve, part of the Judge Advocate Corps. And in the private sector, co-founding Larson and O'Brien in Los Angeles, a nationally recognized litigation firm. And we can all see the fruits of his labor in the last month or two. Historic breakthroughs and agreements between Israel and the Middle East, unheard of, and stuff that should be front page news. And Serbia and Kosovo, a corner of the world that a lot of folks don't understand and don't think about. Organizing and executing a peace summit there. Robert, we're grateful for your service to the country. We're grateful not for you just playing a bureaucratic role, but you playing a problem solver role, because you are making things happen in ways that do promote peace and stability, which is what this conference is all about. We welcome you, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
I'm pleased to introduce former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley in a clip also about Ambassador O'Brien at a previous event.
He helped secure the 2018 release of American pastor Andrew Brunson, and as of the end of 2019, 22 American hostages held overseas had been released during the Trump administration. Even critics such as Peter Bergen concede that when it comes to freeing American hostages, the Trump administration has a good story to tell. Robert O'Brien is an important part of that good story. He is well prepared for the job as National Security Advisor, the best foreign policy job in government, bar none. But I may be prejudiced. He's also one of the most challenging, and we are fortunate to have Robert with us tonight to tell us about it.
Here is former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Dr. Condoleezza Rice at an event earlier this year.
I especially want to thank Robert for your service over these years and the excellent way in which you conducted yourself in the conduct of American foreign policy, and of course for the smooth transition to Jake and to the Biden administration.
And finally, here is the current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's National Security Advisor, at the same event.
First of all, Condi, thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. And I want to just start by thanking Robert for the really great partnership he provided through the transition process. It was a strange and in some ways turbulent transition, but for his part, and Robert, thank you just for everything that you did to help pave the way for me to come into this seat, for our team to get on board, and for us to get up and running at a moment when we face considerable challenges around the world from both great power competitors and, of course, a range of transnational threats as well.
As you can see from the three clips of former National Security Advisors, and especially in the remarks of National Security Advisor Sullivan, Ambassador O'Brien is esteemed by the national security community, of course, but also that at its best, the NSC isn't about politics, though of course politics must impact it. And with a few exceptions, its alumni share a professional courtesy that marks seriousness, the seriousness that comes with everything on the agenda of the NSC. Ambassador O'Brien, with that introduction, the seminar is yours to lead solo tonight, but I have one request. Since everyone, almost everyone, always commits to run the NSC via the so-called Scowcroft model, could you please begin by explaining slowly for the Steelers fans and the USC alum out there exactly what the Scowcroft model is?
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Hugh. I'm going to owe a few people dinners after seeing that, and I'm grateful for and thank my predecessors and my successor, Jake Sullivan and Governor Huntsman, for their kind remarks. It was an honor to serve, and especially to serve in the same chair that Condi and Steve Hadley and Henry Kissinger and many other great leaders served in. I'll have some brief remarks tonight, but I think we've got a really terrific opportunity tonight to at the seminar to hear from some of the folks who really made the NSC run and get their take on it. Let me start with a couple of rules for a national security advisor, and I think it's important to realize that rule number one is that the national security agenda and the foreign policy agenda is the president's. It's not the national security advisors. And the 47 National Security Act of 1947 makes it clear that the function of the NSC is to advise the President of the United States. It's not to set the policy, but to advise them. So I think it's important, and I think Governor Huntsman pointed this out in his comments, that the National Security Advisor is there to advise the President. The full title is the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and it's to advise and assist the President in formulating his policy, his agenda, and he or she is the person elected by the American people to conduct our foreign policy, and our job as the advisor is to facilitate the President, make sure he gets the best options and can implement his own policy. I think the second thing that's important to do, the second important rule, is to adopt Brent Scowcroft's model. And Brent was the national security advisor under both Presidents Ford and President George H.W. Bush, and was a great Air Force officer prior to that, had tremendous experience in government, had a temperament that was just terrific. Unfortunately, when I took office, I'd met Brent before, but did not have a chance to talk to him and get some of his counsel because of his health at the time, and we lost him while he was in office, and that was a tragedy for the country, but he led a great life. But when I look back at new national security advisors taking office, every one of them says that they're going to implement the Scowcroft model. It's kind of a religious incantation, or it's a ritual. Not all of them actually stick to it. I tried to stick to the Scowcroft model right up until January 20th, 2021, when we handed the baton over, our team handed the baton over to Jake Sullivan and his team in the Biden-Harris administration. And so let me explain, at least for me, what the Scowcroft model means. And so number one is the NSC is not operational. And that means that the NSC and directors and senior directors shouldn't be calling in airstrikes. They shouldn't be talking to captains of ships that are going to launch missiles. They shouldn't be consulting with forward commanders out at forward operating bases. They shouldn't be out operationalizing the president's policy. We have the State Department to do diplomacy. We have the DOD to do military. We've got the CIA to collect, and NSA and other agencies to collect. We've got the Treasury Department to implement economic policy, and the other departments and agencies of the government, the Coast Guard, Homeland Security. And those functions shouldn't be operationalized. And there are probably two exceptions to being operational that maybe prove the rule. One are hostage negotiations, where there is a specific role carved out for the NSC, the head of counterterrorism, the senior director for counterterrorism at the NSC. And the other is when the National Security Advisor is going out as a representative of the president to negotiate on behalf of the president. And that's best done in consultation and in coordination with the Secretary of State. But those are the two exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, it shouldn't be operational. Number two, process is important. And no one likes bureaucratic process. I hated it when I was the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I couldn't stand having to go to PCCs or Policy Coordination Committee meetings or Deputies Committee meetings or even principal meetings and hashing things out. I just wanted to have action and move forward. But those meetings are important because you want to make sure that you have a well thought out policy, that the president's received the very best options from his counselors, from his cabinet secretaries and agency heads, and that snap decisions aren't made that might lead to mistakes. And so process is important. Number three, the principals need their day in court. Not the cabinet secretaries and agency heads aren't always going to agree on issues, and sometimes they're going to disagree and disagree vehemently. And I thought it was important in those cases that we crystallized the disagreements, that we really got to the bottom of what the policy concerns were, and then that we made sure the president, or in some cases the vice president, were able to adjudicate the disagreements so that both sides knew that they'd have an opportunity to see the president, that they'd make their best cases, and the president would then make a decision. And then we'd stick with that decision and hopefully not have the decision relitigated or appealed or that sort of thing. I think number four is it's important for the National Security Advisor, because of his or her proximity to the president. You have walk-in privileges in the Oval Office and in the president's dining room. You have walk-in privileges of the residence. You can call the president day or night, and sometimes you have to do that with sad news. For example, if an American service member is killed overseas, or there's a terrorist attack, or so you have constant access to the president. And I think it's important for your cabinet colleagues to understand, that the secretaries and the department heads to understand that you're not going to use that access to the president, your proximity with an office that's down the hall from the Oval Office, to push your own agenda, but that you'll make sure that their views are heard, and that you're an honest broker, and that you present their views fairly, even if they're views that you disagree with. And that garners respect, and I think it helps the entire process. And the reason for that, and look, the president may ask your opinion, and I had opinions on various issues. My predecessors, my successor, all have strong opinions. We've all lived in the foreign policy, national security world. But I always thought it was important for the president to hear everybody else's views, and then allow the president to ask me, either at the close of a meeting, what my thoughts were, or sometimes it'd be later, private in a phone call or in a conversation back in the dining room, at a later time, to say, okay, you heard all the arguments, you heard what everyone had to say, what are your thoughts? And when your colleagues understand that you're going to be fair and present their positions fairly, it builds a lot of confidence and trust in the process. And the reason for all this is, and it was my goal every single day, was to make sure that we got the best possible advice to the President of the United States, that he had the best intelligence, that he had the best analysis, that he had the best arguments and wisdom and counsel from his cabinet secretaries and other key figures in the administration that might be weighing in on an issue. And then with that best advice, the President could make his decisions. And maybe what I'll comment the last point of the Scowcroft model is, once that decision's made, once the President has spoken, and he's the elected leader, none of us, none of the senior staff, none of the cabinet secretaries were actually elected to their positions other than the Vice President. Once the President made his decision, that we try and do our best to make sure that the agencies and departments, all the way down to the lowest operational level, implemented the decision of the President of the United States. And that was kind of the flip side of the NSC not being operational, and the NSC not getting out of its lane and directly working on issues, was to make sure that the agencies that had a responsibility for those issues did so, and did so in a manner consistent with the President's decisions. So, in my view, that's the Scowcroft model. I think we did a pretty good job during the time that I was in office of implementing it, and that's what we tried to do. One of the things that helped us along those lines was a decision I made very early on. It was a decision I made in the first couple days of taking office, and that was to streamline the NSC. I spent some time very early on. Condoleezza Rice, Secretary Rice, was very kind and flew to Washington to see me. I think it was the first weekend or second weekend that I was in office. And she came into her old office on a Sunday afternoon and spent a couple hours with me. And we talked about the size of the NSC. And we talked about the fact that back when John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the policy professionals at the NSC were about 12 people. And he got through the Cuban Missile Crisis with 12 advisors. And we also talked about the fact that when she was in office, facing the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the global war on terror, her NSC was about 105 to 110 policy professionals, covering the whole world. And yet, under President Obama, it ballooned up to almost 250 policy professionals. And her view was, my view was, and several of my predecessors felt the same way, is that the NSC had become unwieldy. We wanted to make sure that the departments and agencies had an access point and knew who they could deal with, knew that that person had access to the National Security Advisor himself or herself. It limited the number of meetings, because the more people at the NSC, the more meetings that they wanted to call with the interagency. And I wanted to have accountability. When I received a memo, I wanted to see 1 or 2 or 3 names on the memo, the director and the senior director that were advising a course of action. And then I could pick up the phone and call them and reach down into the NSC. And it's somebody I knew and hopefully trusted and respected, and could ask them questions about what they were sending up to the front office. And we felt that a lean team could really get more done, and I think we showed that. The number of principal and deputies committee meetings went up to an all-time high during the time that I was in office, working with Matt and Pottinger and Alex Gray. We covered a range of issues in depth that I don't think had been covered, at least in the Trump administration, at that level. And I think most observers, Republican or Democrat, who watched the NSC perform in this streamlined fashion, we're pretty impressed at what we got done in a year and a half. We increased NATO funding by non-U.S. NATO members by $400 billion over 10 years. That had a huge impact, not just for U.S. taxpayers, but also for our ability to defend Europe and the West against Russia and against China. We brought justice to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS who'd killed American hostages, Foley and Sotloff and Kasich and Mueller. We negotiated an economic normalization treaty with Serbia and Kosovo, agreement with a lot of help from Rick Grenell, our ambassador to Germany, who was also serving as a special envoy for the president in that region. We brought about the Abraham Accords, brought peace to Israel and 4 of its Arab neighbors. It was something that was unprecedented. And we helped develop a new bipartisan consensus on the challenge that the People's Republic of China presented to the United States. And it's a challenge we're going to face for generations, maybe the most difficult challenge our country's ever faced. And those are only a few of the things, but it was amazing and maybe a little counterintuitive, by shrinking the NSC, we actually got more done by the NSC. So tonight's program is going to be unique, and I'm actually looking forward to it myself. I don't think we've had a program, or I haven't seen a program like this one before. I've seen a couple of programs where former national security advisors get together and talk, but I haven't seen a program where we have the former chief of staff. So we're going to hear from Alex Gray, who is the chief of staff of the NSC, and he'll talk about the structure of the NSC and how it operates. We're going to hear from Dr. Nadia Shadlow, who was a deputy assistant to the president for national security affairs, and she was responsible she was the architect for the national security strategy, which we used every day in my time in office. We're going to hear from Matt Pottinger, the deputy national security advisor while I was serving, and he'll talk about the NSPM4 process and how we run the NSC. We're going to hear from Kimberly Reed, who's I think the only person on the participant here who actually ran a government department or agency. So we're going to hear from Chairman Reed on her perspective. And then we're going to turn to Congressman Mike Gallagher and hopefully Congressman Mike Waltz, if he can join us to get their view from the Hill. And then we'll have an open discussion with the members of the participants of the seminar to talk about the NSC, how it operates, what works well, what doesn't work well, and how it affects American national security and foreign policy. So I'd like to start with Alex Gray. The former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, used to regularly tell me that Alex Gray was the best Chief of Staff in Washington. And to curry some favor with Mark, I'd usually say, well, he's the second best, isn't he, Mark? And Mark would laugh and say, no, he's the best, in that nice North Carolinian drawl. And I agree. Alex was a terrific Chief of Staff. And oftentimes, the NSC looks like it's moving along and performing very smoothly as we were going forward. And it didn't run very well. But to use a nature metaphor, I always kind of thought of the NSC as a duck, that looked like it was purposely going across a pond and very smoothly and very efficiently moving. And yet, if you look below the surface, the web feet of the duck were paddling frantically to propel the duck forward. And I think there were a lot of days, but more importantly, there were a lot of nights when we were furiously paddling under the surface at the NSC. And that was Alex. So Alex, you and your team, the executive secretary, Secretariat, travel, resource management, worked hard to keep us moving forward. So talk to us about a typical day in the life, if you can, of the National Security Council Chief of Staff, if there is such a thing. And why don't you explain to us the structure of the NSC and its budget and how you operate it on a day-to-day basis in the front office of the National Security Council. So I'll turn it over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Appreciate the opportunity. So a couple things about the NSC that I think help create the context for better understanding what it is and how it operates and how it fits into U.S. national security policy more broadly. The National Security Council is the statutory body that advises the president. It's the secretaries of Treasury, State, Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and some others. The NSC staff are the folks who sit in the old executive office building right across from the West Wing on West Executive Avenue. And they're the ones who, when you hear the NSC colloquially referred to, that's usually who we're talking about. It's the staff. And there are a couple of things about the staff and the institution of the NSC that help kind of set the context for why it is the way it is. The first is that the budget of the NSC traditionally, in Washington terms, is basically negligible. It's about $10 million. And because the budget is so small, there are only at any given time about 20 people who are employees of the NSC who work in policy jobs. So there may be folks who, we've got a whole host of really talented and impressive people who are on the operational side of the NSC, the human resources, the IT, the records management. But in terms of policy professionals, the people that we think of as formulating the policies that make it to the National Security Advisor and to the president, at any given time, there really are only about 25 of them their paycheck comes from the executive office of the president. The rest of the NSC, which policy professionals wise, under Ambassador O'Brien, it was about, by the end of his tenure, it was about 107 policy professionals when he left office. Those folks are over 90% drawn from the departments and agencies of the US government. And we call them detailees. They serve a year to 2 years, and they're brought from their agencies, and most of them serve what we call NSC directors. NSC directors are the backbone of the NSC. They're the working level subject matter experts. They're drawn mostly from the State Department, the Defense Department, the Treasury Department, and the intelligence community, but they come from a whole range of agencies. We have everything from the Labor Department to the Health and Human Services to Energy, and they work in directorates that are regional and they're functional. So we have all the geographic regions of the world covered, but we also have everything from counterterrorism to intelligence to defense policy to weapons of mass destruction and much more. And it's those folks who come from their agencies and their departments, spend year to 2 years at the NSC, that are the kind of, they're the first line of defense for policy at the White House. So what they do, everything from leading the basic level policy process, which is called a sub-PCC or Policy Coordinating Committee. They develop working with their interagency colleagues. They chair those meetings, which are the equivalent to a director is a deputy assistant secretary in one of the other departments. And they send up options and papers to their senior. And their senior is usually what we call a senior director. And the senior directors are traditionally, not always, but traditionally, they're political appointees. And so those are the folks, along with the National Security Advisor and his front office, who are usually the employees of the White House rather than detailees. And so it's these senior directors who are senior director for Asia, senior director for intelligence, and so on. And they are the equivalent of an assistant secretary in the department or agency. And it's these folks who are kind of the middle level, middle to senior level policy folks, where a lot of they chair policy coordinating committees or PCCs, and a lot of the real substantive formulation of policy gets done at that level. Before, and really the only, after that, it's the Deputies Committee, chaired by a deputy secretary, chaired by the Deputy National Security Advisor and attended by the deputy secretaries of the departments, and then up to the Principals Committee, chaired by the National Security Advisor and staffed by the secretaries of the departments. So that's the structure of the NSC. And a large part of why it's so, it's lean and it's staffed mostly by folks from the rest of the interagency is really because the NSC has a tiny budget in Washington terms. A couple of just things to think about in terms of the size of the NSC. So when we talk about the NSC, and it's fluctuated in size, and the ambassador talked about right sizing it to where it was when he left, which was a little under 110 folks. That doesn't count the very impressive and very sophisticated support staff that the NSC has. We've all heard of the White House Situation Room. We don't count that in that number. That's a whole separate part of the NSC, and we left that unchanged in terms of numbers, and they do an amazing job. And we had the records and access management folks. We had the resource management team, which functioned as the NSC's HR department. And we had a whole host of other kind of support elements that were essential to doing the work of the NSC day to day. I think, having spent a year and a half as chief of staff, one of the things that is often talked about as a challenge of the NSC is the inherently small size and the limited budget and the reliance on a detailed staff. I would actually take the converse view. I think it's one of the strengths of the NSC because it really requires the National Security Advisor and his front office it really requires them to operate within the traditional structure of how the NSC was conceived, going back to Kennedy and Eisenhower, which is as an advisory staff for the principals and for the president, not as an operational node of the government. And by having a limited budget, by having a limited staff, it really forces us to go back to first principles. And so I think that in my experience, that was really one of the hidden strengths of the NSC was that we had to operate in that manner to some extent, and it allowed us to really be effective for the president and to come up with some of the achievements that the ambassador mentioned.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. And I always felt like you're putting hamburger helper into the budget and somehow stretching it to make sure that we could accomplish our goals, especially with foreign travel. And you did a terrific job. And thank you for that summary. I think it was for folks that even folks within the government and folks have had contact with the NSC, they were unaware of some of those issues. So thanks for that presentation. I'd like to turn next to Dr. Nadia Shadlow, who's a friend, and she was the Deputy National Security Advisor under my other good friend, H.R. McMaster, who served earlier in the Trump administration. And in December of 2017, President Trump did something that was relatively unique for a first year of a first-term president. He issued the National Security Strategy. And that National Security Strategy, number one, refocused U.S. Attention and refocused the attention of the entire administration, but also of the NSC, on the area of great power competition, the competition between the United States, China, Russia, and really a new era for this country. And we used that strategy almost every day while I was National Security Advisor a couple of years later as I took office. And it was really kind of the Christmas tree that stood, and all the policies and things we did were the ornaments that we put on that national security strategy. Nadia, I know you're modest about this, but you were the architect of the national security strategy and got it ready for the president. If you will, can you take us behind the scenes of how did you develop that document? A lot of cooks in the kitchen on the U.S. strategy for national security, all the departments, the agencies, folks within the White House, Executive Office of the President. How did you corral the interagency to get it done, and then how did you write it so it didn't look like a document that was done by committee, and then without divulging obviously any confidences of your communications or HR's communications with the president? How was it presented to the president, and how did we get that document done in 11 months, which is something that was pretty remarkable?
Well, thanks so much, Robert. And it's great to be here and to see everyone, to see friends, many of whom on this actual call were key to the development of the document. So Matt and Alex and even, Congress, I think Mike Gallagher and I talked about it when he, so there are lots of contributors to the document. I'll start with a little bit. First, I'll step back a little bit and explain why I think strategy overall is important. And then I'll go into some of the specifics. So not only, as Hugh mentioned early on in the call, the 1947 National Security Act created the National Security Council, but it also mandated, it actually did mandate an early national security strategy report from various administrations. The Nixon administration actually used to issue what were called State of the Worlds. They're very well written, very interesting, and I urge people to go back to some of the State Department archives to look at them. It's worth it. In 1986, the Goldwater Nichols Act, which was designed to help the Department of Defense work together more effectively, the services, whether or not it did that, I'm not sure. But nonetheless, it also reaffirmed that an administration needed to get a national security strategy out. President Reagan issued his in 1987, and then every administration has done so. So I sort of knew that going in, because obviously I wanted to read past documents and understand a bit about the process. But also I needed to understand a little bit why they're important overall, to maybe there's some skeptics out there. Well, first, they set a strategic direction for a country, right? They're important because they describe the world as it is, or they should, and that's what the 2017 strategy did. And you need to describe the world correctly or present a correct diagnosis of a problem, because that's the first step toward solving it or toward making progress on it. So that description is important. Second, they transmit this to the citizens of a country, and that's also important, and that's also somewhat debated. When we were going through the process of developing this document, lots of people said, well, Nadia, who are you writing this for? Who are we writing this for? And I said, well, the American people. But that's not really obvious, right? Some wanted it written so that it would appeal to the bureaucracy. Some wanted it written so that it would appeal to allies and partners. Now, it doesn't mean you don't address those audiences, but I think it's a different type of document if it's designed to speak to the American people. And that's important, especially because it's the American people and their congressmen and women and their senators who need to take the decisions to actually make the changes that we needed to make, right? So it was important that there was a baseline understanding of what the United States was facing. And third, the process of strategy formulation itself requires coalition building, right? I think that's an underappreciated element of strategy. Eisenhower did say it, there's that famous quote, but it really is important, that planning process. And it's even more, it's coalition building, because only with those coalitions do you get actual implementation, right? Because as what Ambassador O'Brien said early on, the NSC can't implement anything. It has no money, virtually no staff, no resources. Implementation comes down to all of the departments and agencies, the Defense Department, the State Department, as Mary knows, all the agencies, they're responsible for implementation. And I'm sure Kimberly Reed will talk about that too. So basically, that's why strategy making is important. And I think it plays the same role for businesses as well, right? But it's important. And then fourth, there were also related integrated plans on various regional and functional areas. So they are important too. The strategy is the overarching document, but underneath that, there are specific plans. Matt knows and Alex know with the Indo-Pacific strategy, right? Which I also urge you to take a look at. It was declassified at the end of the Trump administration and it's there on a website somewhere. So all of those elements make strategy important. Now, the Trump administration strategy, I think, was especially important because it really shifted the country in a different strategic direction. For its critics, that was horrifying. For others, it was a welcome sort of, it was necessary, a necessary shift. There were four fundamental assumptions in that document. The first was that the bet that we had made on China in 2001, that China could become a responsible stakeholder in the international system, had not panned out, right? It had expanded its power at the expense of our power and the power of our allies and partners. So that was a fundamental shift. While the previous administration, many actually shared that assessment, the White House chose not to call China a strategic competitor, right? So that was a big difference in the documents, and there are reasons for that we can get into. Second, the Trump strategy recognized that political liberalization and the growth of transnational organizations had not tempered rivalries, that there was still competition going on in these organizations. They depended and they were driven by the desires of the powers that are part of them, right? International organizations exist because countries provide them with the resources, and countries are part of those organizations. So they're driven and they're a part of that great power competition that we've seen. Third, the Trump strategy recognized that globalization and economic interdependence were not unmitigated goods, that they generated inequalities and vulnerabilities, and that needed to be discussed and changes needed to be made. And finally, it also brought out that technologies, especially digital technologies, were perhaps at this point not so much benefiting democratic societies, but favoring authoritarian states, right? Previously, President Bush, President Clinton had hoped that these technologies would help democracies flourish and individuals derive more power. And I think the balance has unfortunately shifted, although that's debatable. So to sum up, fundamentally, the strategy set a different strategic direction for the United States. Now, going in, not everyone, as you can imagine, in various parts of the bureaucracy were going to be happy about challenging some of these assumptions that I mentioned, right? So that was the key issue. So what I wanted to do early on was to be inclusive. I think lots of the bureaucracy at the State Department, at USAID, the Treasury Department, even at DOD, were very nervous about what the Trump administration was going to do coming in. So the first thing we did was say, let's have meetings at the working level, at the, as Ambassador O'Brien said, the PCC level, the policy coordinating committees. These are sort of the working level meetings. Let's bring people together to talk about some of these themes, to help them understand what we were thinking and why. So that's what we did. We had meetings on the concept of sovereignty. That was another key element of the document, right? Because President Trump believed that sovereignty was a really important feature of the international system. And it's not good for democracies to lose their sovereignty. So that was a subject of the meeting. In addition to China, Russia, functional areas such as defense, missile defense, there were about 12 different topics we covered. Now, we could have gone on and done much more than that, but you had to, you know, we were quite cognizant of the time pressure that we were under. As we were hosting these meetings at the National Security Council, we also went out and spoke to the department secretaries. Again, this is part of coalition building. We went to meet with Secretary Ross, with Secretary Perry. Secretary Mattis was in the White House a lot, so we met with him, but we were keeping them informed of what our thinking was and also soliciting their views. And we were also cognizant that this was also a political process as well, right? That's also something we can all talk about, but national security policy making is not apolitical. Different administrations come in with different viewpoints. That's politics. So there's, of course, a political element to all of this. So we made sure to understand the views of everyone. At the same time, early on, we decided to structure the document around four main interests, key American interests. Now, you would think that most national security strategies would begin with what are America's interests, but actually many past ones that I mentioned don't. You have to find them. They're sort of in there, but they're kind of buried in there. But we decided that we would structure ours around what became known as these four pillars: protect the homeland, increase economic prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and advance American values. And we began to talk about that. And I remember even Christian White on this call came in, and we were also reaching out to media and to others to explain what we were thinking. Now, every administration wants to do those things: protect the homeland, preserve peace through strength, advance American values. But the difference is in the how they do it, how they think about that problem set. That's where the difference is. So as I mentioned, the Trump administration thought about all of these areas in a different way from the previous administration. While this was going on, we began to draft each of these four pillars. Okay, what did the president mean by promoting American prosperity and growing American prosperity? What did he mean by preserving peace through strength, advancing American values? Each of these pillars had a description. And we did, as you mentioned, Robert, we really did try to make the description as clear as possible. So the beginning of the document, which is just a few pages, I happen to have it here, on my desk. It's not that long, right? It's really not that long. And if you just read the first sort of 7-8 pages, which I think even my son's high school friends did, a couple of them did. He didn't read it, but many of them did. And many of them would say to me on the sidelines of a game when I was able to get to the game that they understood it. They liked it. And that made me feel really good because that was the purpose of it. So we were drafting, and at the same time we were communicating. We were communicating directly with DOD colleagues, with the Department of Homeland Security, with individuals in the Treasury Department, making sure that their inputs were taken into account the whole time, but also drafting ourselves, keeping the electrons, as it's known, keeping the document on our computers. There are 4 people in my office total, and we kept close control over the document, because especially at the end, some of you will not be surprised. Lots of people tried to stick things into the document that shouldn't have been there. I see Mary smiling because I know, having worked at the State Department, probably happened. So you saw people trying to just change words, but words that would actually have significance. You saw people trying to add words, but words that would also have significance. So we wanted to make sure at the end, that we knew what was in there, because by the end, everything is always more rushed, and you do naturally have less control than you'd like. throughout this process as well, General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, briefed the president quite often on the contours of the document. He traveled with him often. And as you know, Ambassador O'Brien, when you're on a plane, it's a good place to get a principal, right? Many of you on this call know planes are those times and you can get someone's attention because, you know, there's nowhere to go and no one else can sort of try to get into the meeting. So that was a good time for the National Security Advisor to discuss how the document was unfolding. I also had the opportunity to brief the president twice, I think, on the document, once with slides where we were working on the contours of it, and then later in more detail. We worked very closely with the speechwriters as well, his speechwriters. So there was a lot of collaboration. And I would like to say, you know, throughout this whole time where there were a lot of leaks coming out of the administration for all different reasons, it was one of the few things that was not leaked, which was sort of interesting, I think, because there was enough sense that people felt that they were a part of it. And by the end, they wanted to see it. And then finally, we also worked quite closely with allies and partners. I went to think tanks often, they hosted events. So there was a lot of communication with allies and partners during that period. And many of the deputy chiefs of mission and ambassadors in town, you know, will back me up and later sort of said, hey, Nadia, you know, you really, I mean, the Trump administration at that time was communicating more with our allies and partners than in many instances of the previous administration, which again, you know, in at least in the Washington context, I was conscious of ensuring that they came into the old executive office building. We held meetings on that bottom floor because you can't, that's where you're allowed to hold meetings. And they were appreciative, I think. So there was nothing surprising in the document to them in the end. So I'll leave it there. I've talked enough. I think, did I cover what you wanted, Ambassador?
Nadia, that was a tour de force. Thank you. And I urge everyone, if you haven't read the National Security Strategy of 2017, it's really a model of clarity. And I can see why your son, I bet your son read it. He may just not have told you, but I can see why his friends. I can see why his friends read it and understood it and enjoyed it. It was a terrific document. That was an extraordinary, excellent exposition of how it came to be. Thank you. Let me turn now to Matt Pottinger, my good friend and my deputy. When I selected Matt to be my deputy, one of the first things that Henry Kissinger said to me before talking about any policy is he said, you know, Pottinger, good move. And so I was pleased to have Matt as my deputy. He became one of the best known APD, or Deputy National Security Advisors probably in history with his work on COVID in China. So Matt, let me get you to take just about 5 minutes to talk to us about what would happen when an issue showed up in the presidential daily brief or a crisis emerged, and you can address either a real or a hypothetical issue, and show us the map, how you got the policy process working, starting with the sub-PCC to the PCC to the DC, and how you got things teed up so by the time I got to chair a principal committee meeting, often with you at my side, how did that happen? And maybe you can just give us a historical context of how the government made these decisions both before and after the 1947 Act and before and after there was an NSC. And try and do that in 5 minutes because I do want to hear from Kim Reed and the congressman as well and some of the other participants. But I think you probably conducted more deputies committee meetings and more process than any other deputy and for that same period of time in NSC history. So give us a rundown of how you did it.
Hey, Ambassador O'Brien, thanks so much. I'll keep it short. I took the hint, and maybe what I'll do is just tell a quick story because the NSC at its inception was first imagined as a way to constrain the President of the United States. And luckily that plan failed spectacularly, and it ended up becoming an instrument of the President of the United States to serve him and to ensure that his intent would actually be faithfully carried out. But it goes back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And one of the things that people forget is that, by the time that he died in the closing months of World War II, the permanent government, that's like a polite term for the deep state, okay? Or, the career bureaucracy was actually really exasperated with FDR. FDR was not a process guy. He was not someone that followed, did a lot of meetings with a lot of process, and he didn't have a national security advisor. He didn't have an NSC staff. He didn't even really have a chief of staff. There were no joint chiefs. He basically had the Department of the Navy and the Department of War, which was really the Army. And he liked to do things one-on-one. He didn't like having cabinet meetings. He didn't like NSC style meetings. He used to say, the left hand never knows what the right hand's doing. He would sometimes assign the same task to two different, cabinet officers. And it was just his style. He would basically write his decrees in letters and send them out to his commanding generals in the field during the war. And so by the end of, a war and 12 years of FDR, the government bureaucracy was pretty exhausted. They were exasperated. They really wanted to build more process around the President of the United States. And they also assumed that President Truman wasn't going to be up to the job. And this is a funny recurring theme in American history, that a sitting president and the bureaucracy usually assumes that the incoming president isn't going to be up to the job. And you saw this with when President Reagan was elected. The Republican establishment, the Republican Party establishment, assumed that he was not up to the task, that he was going to be a lightweight. They tried to convince him to bring on Gerald Ford as his vice president, so that it would be a quote unquote co-presidency. They said he needs to have Henry Kissinger come back in and be his Secretary of State. And Reagan turned all of this down, and I think he did pretty well. He defeated the Soviet Union and won the Cold War, so he did just fine. Following his own instincts. Same thing happened. Even President Truman thought that Ike, a five-star hero of World War II, Supreme Allied Commander, wasn't going to be up to the job because he was going to be too rigid. And they even made fun of Ike after Ike took office. He made fun of the fact that he had a chief of staff. He said, "You don't need a chief of staff. You should be your own chief of staff. What's the matter with you? Are you an automaton?" So he himself, Truman, was a victim of this sort of prejudice, of this recurring theme that people weren't going to be up to the job. So the Department of Defense tried to build an NSC as they built this concept that would really just be the Pentagon into the White House. They would be liaison officers and so forth, but really the Pentagon was really going to run policy, and the nice president sitting over there in the Oval Office would kind of take their advice. Well, Truman was a very, very smart, very shrewd and tough operator. His aw shucks Midwestern demeanor notwithstanding, he wasn't going to get taken for a ride. So he co-opted the NSC and began shaping it into his own staff. And that's what it really became. It's what President Eisenhower ended up perfecting, and what went on to become, the Scowcroft model. And it only works when it's really the president's staff. It also really only works when the staff who work on the NSC realize that they aren't necessary. They're good. The president's going to be more successful when he has a loyal NSC staff. But we've had presidents who've won world wars without an NSC staff. So I always try to remind the NSC staff to be humble about the fact that America's done pretty well even without us. But with all the complexity today, it's preferable to have a staff that's loyal to the president, that is going to be the honest broker. No other department or agency, whenever a department or agency is put in charge of something and they try to coordinate, it always goes badly because the other department really want to listen or subordinate themselves to another cabinet member. So it's really only the National Security Advisor, and by proxy, his deputy National Security Advisor, and then his senior directors and directors who have that mandate to convene the U.S. government and to be an honest broker and to squeeze options out and to present those options up to the next level. And that's really what I was doing as deputy.
Hey, thanks, Matt. That was terrific, and terrific history, and it's always interesting to see how the bureaucracy, how they reacted to Truman, how they reacted to Eisenhower, how they reacted to Reagan, and certainly we saw some of that with President Trump as well. So let me turn to Chairman Kim Reed. Kim was the chairman of the Ex-Im Bank, so she's the only person on the video tonight, including me, who actually headed a department or agency of the U.S. government. The Ex-Im Bank is a economic organization, and so you understand the refrain from the national security strategy that Nadia talked about, that economic security is national security. Give us a brief synopsis of how your agency worked with the NSC to promote our economic security, what it was like to sit in the principals meeting as running an agency, or to travel on the plane with us on delegations when we were going overseas, and give us your view as a department head, which is a little different than the rest of us who've been talking so far, who were staffers of the president.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's great to be with all of you and talk about how important the NSC is to our economic security. I was a nominee for 2.5 years, finally confirmed in May of 2019, 79-17 outstanding vote. But during that 2.5-year confirmation process as a nominee, I followed closely what was going on in the White House. And when the national security strategy came out in December of 17, I read it fully. And Pillar 2 says, promote American prosperity, promote free, fair, and reciprocal economic relationships. And Ex-Im appears, not Ex-Im, exports appears 14 times in the document, including a really important sentence that I knew I needed to embrace as I sought to lead Ex-Im. And that was, we will provide Americans new opportunities to increase their exports. And so I had that going in starting in December of 17, finally confirmed in May of 19. And as any new leader would do, going into an organization, our Export-Import Bank, as you may know, is our nation's official export credit agency. It has 515 employees. And it had technically been shut for about 4 years because there was not a Senate-confirmed board. And you need a board to do the deals over $10 million. And this agency at any one time has the capability of lending or guaranteeing loans of up to $135 billion at any one time. So what happened in those 4 years? We now have 116 export credit agencies around the world. The People's Republic of China has 2 official, lots of unofficial export credit activities, also known as debt trap diplomacy. And our agency had been shut, 87-year-old agency. So I show up, I know what the national security strategy says, and I did a survey of our great team. And guess what? We didn't have a national security advisor, and we really weren't plugged into the NSC process that you've heard about. And that probably happened because we weren't fully operational. And so I created the very first national security advisor at Ex-Im, recruited a great guy, Jamal Wherever, to do that, and said, we need to get plugged into these processes that you're hearing about, the PCC processes, and started figuring that out and had to focus our deal team, Stephen Wren, our chief banking officer, and other leaders within our agency. I'm like, we need to get plugged into what the NSC is doing. And worked hard to do that. And I really appreciate all the colleagues joining me this evening because they understood that this was important. As we say, economic security is national security. So we started attending those meetings and knowing that financing is a key part of equipping partners and allies around the world to buy made in the USA goods and services. And Ex-Im plays that role. And so I was so thrilled that Ambassador O'Brien came on board at the NSC about the same time that I started my role at Ex-Im, because Robert and I have known each other very well since the year 2002. So I had the great honor of being sure that Ex-Im was front and center at the White House. And in fact, Robert was the very first national security advisor to visit Ex-Im's headquarters, which we really appreciated. And the ambassador and I were able to travel to really strategic, important locations, Brazil, Philippines, Indonesia. And even when we were flying there, he would have me do other work and other calls to line up efforts on my own, which which included being very focused on nuclear and went into Poland. We care about that. Congress gave us a huge mandate in December of 2019, the longest reauthorization of XM in our history, a 7-year reauthorization to give certainty to the world that they should be looking to us as they choose where they should buy their goods and services. And with that, Congress also said, and thank you, Congressman Gallagher, for serving on the China task force. We want XM to stand up a program on China and transformational exports, where we were given the authority to match the rates, terms, and conditions that the Chinese may be offering foreign purchasers around the world as they were building their Belt and Road Initiative. So we got a new authority. And I know that the NSC was critical in that, and particularly Matt Pottinger, who's such an expert on this topic. And I've really appreciated his support of XM and what we could do to be of help. So a lot of diplomacy. Also, Abraham Accords, we played a strong role in that. And I hope that with the Biden administration that they will continue on this trajectory. It is so important that all the economic agencies are tied into the NSC process where it makes sense. And I think that we developed a good roadmap for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kim. You were a terrific chairman of XM. I always like traveling with you, not just because you're a friend, but you also carried a huge checkbook. So when we showed up in these countries, I could talk to about national security issues and the importance of our alliance. But it always was nice to have Kim or our friend Adam Bowler, who often traveled with us from the DFC, come write big checks. And politicians are the same all around the world. If you can bring jobs and bring money, it helps. You played a key role. So thank you.
I want to just say one thing, Robert. You put together a great team, and what I really appreciated, it went top down integration. So thank you for that. Teammates like Brad McKinney and even our GC, very involved with what you do, and thank you.
Well, thanks, Kim. You were terrific. A couple people have mentioned Mike Gallagher, so I think he's the most important third-term congressman in the world and in the U.S. now, and is a great strategist in his own right, and is going to be a future Secretary of State or senator or governor from Wisconsin or president. So Mike, tell us from your view at the Hill, your perspective. What you think of policy at the NSC, how it gets made. You're an expert on China and defense matters. So how do we do on those issues in the Trump administration? How's the current administration doing? How's the current NSC doing, working through some of those complex issues? And again, from Congress's point of view, how can the NSC process improve? It's obviously different down on our end, or my old end of Pennsylvania Avenue than the one where you're sitting. But how does the NSC improve the process from your point of view, sitting in Congress and the House of Representatives from Wisconsin?
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you to everyone for those presentations. I just would say at a time when there's not much Congress agrees upon, I am continually struck by the amount of bipartisan consensus that remains surrounding the fundamentals of your national security strategy. In other words, take Trump's, biggest critic, and I don't think you'll find that person criticizing the fundamentals of the national security strategy. And as evidence of that, I just would point to some of the most loud voices when it comes to criticizing the Chinese Communist Party for their human rights abuses in Xinjiang province, for example, are card-carrying members of the Squad, whose rhetoric is indistinguishable at times from notable Republican hawks. I co-chaired a commission on U.S. cyber policy, where if you read our final report, the entire thing is an argument for waking up to what China is doing in cyberspace. Similarly, right now, I'm involved with Congressman Mike Waltz, who is actually the most important congressman that exists right now, on shoring up supply chain vulnerabilities, which is an effort to learn some of the lessons from the pandemic, which is to say that we are too dependent on communist China for the manufacturing of basic things such as advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, an increased scrutiny on the manufacturing of semiconductors, rare earths, the list goes on and on and on. So whether it was by design or serendipity, you managed to produce the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War and get bipartisan buy-in to that shift in Congress. And I think that will endure no matter what mistakes we might make over the next 4 years. And I'm reminded of, if you examine the NSC transcripts during the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration, where Nixon was a participant in the NSC, and on the rare occasion when Eisenhower missed chairing the NSC, Nixon chaired the NSC, talked about this when he campaigned for president. Nixon is constantly teasing out the domestic political implications of geopolitical developments and constantly chiming in to remind Eisenhower of how Congress is going to react to various proposals. And I think that is a valuable lens of analysis that at times a member of Congress is not sure is being debated in the NSC. And I think it proves that when the NSC takes small steps, such as inviting members of Congress to the Situation Room and having a candid discussion with no cameras present, it can go a long way in terms of building buy-in for a pretty dramatic foreign policy shift. When Matt Pottinger came to address the Republican conference and just talked about the administration's approach to China, I still hear comments about that discussion being one of the most valuable ones that happened behind closed doors. And so there's a variety of informal ways in which I think the NSC can bridge the gap between Article 1 and Article 2, even though at times we sort of think of the value of the NSC is that it isn't constantly testifying before Congress. But I think there's a world in which you can have those conversations, frankly, behind closed doors. The final thing I'd say as it relates to the new administration, I do think there are some in the administration that genuinely believe in the foundation that all of you have built and do not want to destroy that foundation and rather want to build upon that foundation. But I think it's also fair to say that there's a split in the administration, and that there are some who might prioritize climate change as a geopolitical issue above all else, and thus might try and adopt a more cooperative relationship with China, which really doesn't work in terms of the framework that all of you set out. And then I think the second area that gives me concern is what I view as an emerging rejection of the Abraham Accords. In other words, I think if the administration rushes to put the Iran nuclear deal back together with duct tape, that naturally will mess up the de facto alliance structure that you built with the Abraham Accords and produce chaos in the region. And therefore, the Biden foreign policy could somewhat ironically and tragically suffer the same fate as the Obama foreign policy, which is to say a well-intentioned effort to pivot to the Pacific and focus on China runs aground because of increasing chaos in the Middle East that they can't manage because they misunderstand the fundamental alliance structure. That being said, it's too early to tell. My interest as a member of Congress is in maintaining that bipartisan consensus that I think you all built, but it's very fragile right now. And as every administration learns, a national security strategy is just a rudder, right? It's a rudder that allows you to navigate a lot of very unexpected storms that come your way. And, for your administration, I think that was coronavirus. And we don't know what this administration's unexpected shock is going to be. It could well be a conflict over Taiwan. It can be the invasion of Ukraine. It could be, the Iranians breaking out towards a nuclear weapon. We don't know, but they will be tested. And that's when we'll get a sense of to what extent they're adopting your overall framework or whether they're rejecting it. And I think they would be wise not to reject it.
Thanks, Michael. And look, I think everyone watching and certainly all of us know on the all of the participants here in the Nixon Seminar understand how important it is that you're in Congress, your expertise, your wisdom, your counsel. And I really hope that as I reached out to some of my Democrat colleagues on the Hill in the House and Senate while we were in office, I really hope that Jake and Tony Blink and others will reach out to you because you bring just a terrific perspective. So thanks, Congressman. I think we've got Mike Waltz on as well. So we'll go from Marine Captain Mike Gallagher to Army Colonel Waltz if he's with us. And Mike's.
Oh, go ahead, Ambassador. Sorry.
No, Mike's got a unique resume. He actually, everyone on the panel has a very unique resume, and it's a credit to Hugh and to Mike Pompeo, and I'll take a little bit of responsibility for it, but we've really put together a terrific team. But you served both at the White House and then you eventually went up to Congress. So you've served as both an elected representative, currently serve as an elected representative, but you also served in the White House. Give me your what's the biggest difference from the way that foreign policy, national security policy is formulated up on the Hill compared to what you saw at the White House when you were working for the Vice President in the Bush administration?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Robert and Hugh and everyone for putting this group together. I think I think we could probably go several hours examining a lot of these issues. Obviously we've talked a lot about the National Security Act in 1947 and the creation of the National Security Council structure. But importantly, that also created the Defense Department structure. At that time, you had parallel lines to the president through the Department of the Army and Air Services before the Air Force, and through the Department of Navy. And frankly, they really liked it that way. And they didn't want that to change. And from their perspective, they had just won a world war, really two, with that structure. And probably the most controversial piece was the Standing Intelligence Service. And given our history of individual liberties and state and local rights, there was a lot of concern and resistance to putting a permanent intelligence structure in place. Congress forced that and saw the need for restructuring, because unlike every other war, we weren't going to send all our troops back home and stand the Army down that we had stood up just for the war. We had a new thing to deal with, and that was the Cold War. And for the first time in our history, needing that standing military force, that standing intelligence agency. And so I think Congress often has a pretty painful role, which we all know, but has that powerful forcing function. I just wanted to take a moment, since I have had a unique background in serving the White House, but I also served in the Pentagon and the Office of Secretary of Defense under Rumsfeld and Gates. But importantly, as a reservist, as a reserve special forces officer, in between those civilian tours, actually would mobilize and go out to the front line. So I had to be one of the only idiots in Washington that actually had to go do the strategy that I was recommending. So you kind of better make sure you get it right. And that back and forth was really fascinating and illuminating. I can't tell you how many times I was out on the ground and we were doing something completely different than what the principals had discussed and the president had authorized. And I, in the room, kind of uniquely and trying to humbly say, guys, this isn't what the president said to do. And then the fascinating part would be to go back to Washington, take the uniform off, and say, hey, boss, here's how it's really going on the ground. And so you talked a lot about teeing decisions up to the president and the process for doing that. But I saw, almost equally as importantly was the NSC's role in ensuring that those policies were executed in the manner that the president intended throughout the massive bureaucracy. And I mean, I could tell story after story. I know you all could as well. One that really stands out in my mind was, the President Bush, against all odds and all advice, decided to double down on the surge in Iraq. And it just wasn't being executed, and finally brought on the war czar, if we remember that title, in Doug Lute, to actually really hammer home the execution. Because it wasn't being fully executed, because a lot of the agencies, frankly, weren't fully bought into the policy. So I think that execution piece is incredibly important, and it's especially important when it's outside of the traditional national security structures of state aid, defense, and the ICs. Obviously, the competition with China is not whole of government, it's whole of society, meaning we're bringing in the Department of Education with what's going on with the illicit funding of our education institutions. We're bringing in DHS and the 400,000 Chinese students, or the technology theft, Commerce's entity list, the struggles that we're having with Wall Street and the continued investment in, and even lobbying against some of the restrictions that we in Congress have tried to put in place. So that true whole of government. I mean, one of the questions I'm looking forward to asking the Biden administration is why their China task force is only in the Defense Department and not a whole of government, whole of society task force, taking a look at all of these issues. But finally, I would just say most importantly, bringing it full circle to where I started with the National Security Act of 47, I think Congress can have an incredibly important forcing function on a bureaucracy that's often ossified and doesn't want to change. And whether that is platforms like the carrier Navy that we had in World War II, or the A-10 that survived Gulf War I and was so instrumental, saved my life on two occasions in the War on Terror, but almost died several deaths in the 90s. Jointness with the Goldwater Nichols Act that pulled together, near and dear to my heart, created Special Operations Command in the wake of Grenada and the failed Iranian hostage rescue. When we can go down the list of the War Powers Act, the Defense Production Act, the Patriot Act, that where Congress has had a key role in taking the national bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy, kind of to that next level. And I think with Mike Gallagher leading the charge, both of us served on the China task force, or are now on the supply chain, that President Gallagher will take those lessons to the future. But I think finally, where it is uniquely different for us is that we have very different bosses than everybody in the executive branch, right? We're directly accountable to the American people every 2 years. And boiling these issues down to their everyday lives, when many people are just trying to make it week to week, create a better life for their kids, standing in front of the town hall and explaining why the Space Force, everyone make your jokes, but why it was so critical, how many times every one of them in that audience touches space every day, how our entire economy is now dependent on what's up there, from agriculture to global real-time logistics to our financial sector, and how the Russians and Chinese know that and intend to take those assets out and therefore shut down our modern economy. That had to be defended, and that's why this new branch of the military. So explaining that to people in a way that they're kind of nodding their heads and feel okay about the amount of their tax dollars being used, whether it's that or whether it's foreign aid being used effectively, or the size of the military budget, that direct accountability, I think, is incredibly important, can be incredibly frustrating and difficult, as Mike knows. But it's every 2 years. It truly is the people's house. And us retaining those authorities and being directly accountable, I think is incredibly important, an incredibly important piece of that policy formulation process. And I think with that, I'll stop, Robert, and really thrilled to be a part of this group.
Thank you, Mike. And what you and Mike Gallagher, Congressman Gallagher, bring to this group is that you were actually elected to office. I just want to make a quick aside. As Mike talked about his service overseas, when I think about who's on the panel, and I'll leave somebody out, but Mike is a Special Forces officer in the United States Army and fellow soldier, and Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher are Marines. Morgan Ortegas is an intel officer in the Navy. So we've got a number of folks here, and I probably, if I've left you out, I apologize and chime in. But we've got a number of veterans and reservists who are with us. I just want to thank everybody again for their service, and it's great to see our veterans and service members going into Congress and going into the administration and bringing that unique perspective that they have into the policy world. And again, thank you for all of you who've served in uniform for what you've done. Hey, let me go to, and I don't know how much time we've got left, but I want to go to comments or questions from the floor, because we've got a bunch of participants here as I look around that have participated in NSC meetings as PCCs and deputies representing their departments. So I'm going to turn to Alex Gray and ask him. I think you've got some folks teed up that would like to make a comment or have a question. And can you call on who's up next? I think Morgan Ortegas may have had a question if she's still on the line.
Yeah, why don't we go to Morgan first?
we may not have Morgan, so we'll come back to Morgan. And who do you have next, Alex?
Let's do Christian Whiten.
Great, thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Robert. Kimberly Reed, I think, said a great comment, which is you brought an excellent team to the NSC. But question is about your predecessors in this administration, the Trump administration, and also, frankly, in the Bush administration. A lot of people, a lot of Republicans felt that the NSC at times was working against the president. And just to throw out two examples from the Trump administration, you had, for example, Fiona Hill at the beginning of the administration, came from the left-wing Brookings Institution. At one point earlier in our program, Nadia said it's important to consider politics in national security. Of course it is. That means you're considering democracy, and we are a democracy. But Fiona, when she came in, I think she told K.T. McFarland, don't look at sanctions on Russia through a political lens. It's just the right thing to do, which really is sort of a bureaucrat saying, just ignore the will of the American people, ignore this guy who went and got elected. Anyway, Fiona went on to become a fairly outspoken opponent to the president. One other quick example, Alexander Vindman, the fat colonel in charge of Ukraine policy, seemed to think that it was illegal for the president to tamper with the interagency process, as if the bureaucrats were in charge. Now, these weren't your choices. It was before you got there, and you did a great job, I think, of writing the NSC. My question is, for the next Republican president, is there a way that we can avoid having an NSC that's sort of, especially if it's a new Republican president with a change in power, to avoid a year or two of having a disloyal or ineffective NSC? Alex mentioned that you rely a lot on detailees because the budget isn't that big by Washington standards. Can you detail a bunch of people to AID or the Commerce Department or the Pentagon and then detailing them back? What are your thoughts on how the next Republican can get the NSC right?
Well, look, I think we had some great folks who were loyal to the president prior to the time that I got there, and one great example of that is Nadia, who's on the program with us tonight and did a terrific job writing the national security strategy. But you make a good point, and I think it's a point that Alex made, that Pottinger made, and that is the president deserves to have a staff that's loyal to him, that doesn't leak, that is going to implement his policies. They don't necessarily need to agree with the president on every issue, but the staff and the bureaucracy, whether it's at the NSC or anywhere in government, needs to understand that, unlike Mike Gallagher and Mike Waltz, who are with us tonight, they weren't elected to anything. They're there as the staff of the President of the United States, or they're officers of the government, and the president was elected, and the American people selected him or her to implement their policy. That's why I generally think that for the most part, presidents are entitled to the nominees of their choosing, whether it's a Republican or Democrat president. I think at the NSC, the president's entitled to a staff, especially at the senior director level, that he trusts and may not always agree with them, but at the end of the day understands that he's the President of the United States or she's the President of the United States, and will implement those policies and make sure the President gets the best advice possible. So staffing up the NSC, I think, is a critical, very early task for a new administration. It should actually be considered during the summer, during the transition period, prior to the election even occurring. The President ought to be thinking about who those senior directors should be, and to their credit, I think the Biden administration and Jake Sullivan did a good job on that front. They knew who they wanted. Their folks were in immediately, and at least from a leak perspective and a policy perspective, they're running a tight organization, maybe a little bit better than happened in the early days of the Trump administration. But I think you make a good point, and that is the next Republican nominee ought to be thinking, once he or she is nominated, that they ought to start thinking about their NSC senior directors, their national security advisor, deputy national security advisor, chief of staff, very early on in the process, because it's a critical role. So good point there. I won't comment on any specific personalities, but the president should have a competent, capable team that he's thought about and put in place early on in the administration. So thank you, Christian. Alex, who do we have teed up next?
Next, we have Monica Crowley.
Great,
Thank
Monica.
you, Alex. Hi, Ambassador. Nice to see you. Thanks to you and to all of our speakers tonight. So early on, President Nixon realized that the development and implementation of his innovative foreign policies, like détente with the Soviet Union, the opening to China, were going to require a very tight lid. So one of the very first things he did was consolidate decision-making in the NSC under Dr. Kissinger, which had the effect of essentially marginalizing the State Department. So could you speak to the relationship between the Trump NSC, the State Department, other relevant agencies in that decision-making process? How collaborative was it really?
That's a great question, Monica. And one of the nice things about having Monica here and having Chris Cox here is the connection that we have to the Nixon family, to President Nixon himself, and the legacy that is the Nixon Library and the Nixon Foundation. And Monica worked closely with President Nixon. So it's great having you and Chris part of this seminar, because it ties us back to the reason that we're all here at the library in Yorba Linda. I know most people are remote, but I'm lucky enough to be down here at the library. It's a good question, and traditionally there's been some rivalry between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, because you have these two principal officers of American diplomacy. I was very fortunate that I'd worked closely with Secretary Pompeo prior to becoming the National Security Advisor. I think he was one of the people that recommended me for the job to President Trump. So we had a very strong working relationship. We brought a lot of hostages home and worked on a lot of policy in Afghanistan and the Middle East together. When I was an ambassador sitting over, although I was a presidential envoy, I was seated over at the State Department and spent a lot of time in Mike's office up on the 7th floor. So that background leading into me taking the position, I think, was very helpful in us cooperating. And look, we had the same goals. We had the same goals as the president, and that was, peace through strength. We wanted to make sure that America was strong enough to deter our allies or our adversaries and reassure our allies, and that meant bringing Americans home, bringing justice to terrorists, strengthening our military and strengthening our alliances. And Mike and I had the same outlook on those issues. So we were fortunate to work closely together. Didn't mean we agreed on everything, and there were plenty of times when I picked up the phone and may have gotten an earful from Mike, if he wasn't happy about the way some process was run or that sort of thing, or I may have had to call him from time to time, but we got along great. We're close friends, and I think that cooperation was one of the things that allowed us to achieve the accomplishments for the president that took place in the end, especially at the end of the first term of the Trump administration, Abraham Accords and other things we've already talked about tonight. We also had some other key players in the Abraham Accords. We had Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and their team, and so the NSC was able to play a bridging and a coordinating role between Jared and his team and the State Department, and that's something that, again, there could be some natural rivalries there, but I think we did a great job as an NSC in helping to ameliorate those rivalries and get to a result that was good for the president, good for the American people, and good for the world. So, again, things aren't always personality driven, but I think that relationship with Mike certainly helped at the State Department level. I had a great relationship with my fellow Californian, Steve Mnuchin, and again, we didn't always agree on every issue, but there was a lot of respect there. And we tried to foster an atmosphere of respect and camaraderie among the cabinet secretaries and department heads, so that even when there was a disagreement, it was a disagreement on policy grounds, not on not on personalities. And then look, like you do when you're a lawyer and you can't get a case settled, we take it to the judge, and the judge in our case was the President of the United States, and he'd make a policy call, and then we'd try and make sure that everybody got on board with that policy call. But great question. I think we've got time for one more short question or comment, and then we're going to have to wrap things up here in just a couple of minutes. So if we've got one more, Alex, I think we've got time for a quick comment or question.
That's the last question I had. Unless Morgan Ortega says anything, I think that's all in the queue.
Hey, that's terrific. I want to thank everybody who participated tonight. Especially for policy nerds and wonks. I hope this is a video that the Nixon Library will get out and the foundation will get out, and I think it might be very helpful to folks that are studying and would like to go into government and would like to be in national security to get a real feel for how the process works at the White House, but also on Pennsylvania Avenue. Special thanks to Alex for sharing your thoughts, Nadia and Matt Pottinger, the two Deputy National Security Advisors, Kim, there are two congressmen, Congressman Gallagher and Congressman Waltz, and for those who asked questions or made comments. I also want to thank the Nixon Foundation and its generous donors for making this seminar possible. This is something that was conceived by Hugh Hewitt and the Nixon Foundation, and I think it's a true public service in the best tradition of President Nixon, who loved foreign policy, loved national security, and loved this country. And if you get a chance, if you're from somewhere else in America, come out to Yorba Linda, and it's a terrific library and experience, and you really get to know President Nixon and his family here. I want to remind our viewers we'll be back at the same time next month, the second Tuesday of every month. We're here at the Nixon Seminar. And next month's going to be very special. It's a program to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the return by President Nixon and the American people of Okinawa to Japan. And so we'll discuss that seminal moment, and we'll also discuss the current state of the U.S. and U.S.-Japanese alliance, which is probably the most critical relationship in the world right now as we face a rising China that was discussed so eloquently by a number of our panelists tonight. So again, I'm Robert C. O'Brien. Good night from the historic Nixon Library in beautiful Yorba Linda, California, and have a wonderful week, everyone. Thank you, and God bless.